Another quilt in the series, looking at the quilts and deciding how I can quilt it. We have a traditional quilt block, and the quilt is about 59 by 67 inches, which makes all of these divisions about 2 inches apart. And that would make the outside border about 4 inches, the inner border about 2 inches, and then you have cream border when matching the background, that's 2 inches as well. Let's look at this quilt. First of all, can we quilt it with all over quilting? You know, almost all the time I'll say, of course we can. What could we do? And my most favorite design for doing something like that, if we really want to quilt it all over, would be your swirl hook. You could quilt just the center portion and do one of the other designs I'll show you on the outer borders, inner and outer, or you can do the entire quilt edge to edge simply with a design like that. I like to stay pretty nondescript and simple so that I don't take away from my blocks. Do I need to stitch in the ditch? The individual quilter would need to see how the seams laid, especially where we matched with these half square triangles and in these little jewels that we have. Just beautiful on this quilt, just gorgeous. This quilt was by Debbie, by the way. Beautiful quilt. If we have pretty heavy seams, we might want to do some stitching in the ditch. Also on this little one up in the corner of the blocks, the cornerstones, we might consider doing some stitching in the ditch to the extent that the quilt would lay down real well. What if we want to look at this quilt in a more traditional way? And let's talk about stitching in the ditch first. I love this. I really do love the way this turned out. Traditional being we can come in all of the background quilting and do something like the leaves and swirls. You can throw in some of these little things as well. Gorgeous. I love it. Stitching in the ditch. At the minimum, you can do it 2 different ways. We can stitch in the ditch on our main blocks. So it would be in the sashing and then the quilt blocks themselves. So we could do that. However, when you stitch this, you're going to be going around all of this right up to the blocks. So as an alternative, what you might want to do, and again, you need to consider the piecing and how that lays. But what might be an alternative is to stitch the actual outline of the quilt block. And then, if you're not going to do anything in these very small pieces, which at most are going to be 1 inch that way, and then you've cut it in a diagonal, you're not going to have a whole lot. So at the very least, you might want to come inside of this. And you can do that by going around your design and then stitching right on a seam right there and coming in and doing that. You can do some traveling on your stitching in the ditch. So I would consider that. Then we could do anything in all of the background stitching. We can take, and I show this somewhere else, we could take, using these seams, again, you know I love this, is do your cross hatching using those lines. On the outer side, you could do straight lines using the points of that cross hatching, but what I was showing you here is every other one, you could come and do a third one just to do something different. Would add some uniqueness to this quilt. In the cornerstone, I would probably just stitch in the ditch here and stitch in the ditch the main blocks. And keep this one pretty simple, and whatever else you needed to do. That is a beautiful way to look at this quilt. Join me now for maybe another way to look at quilts. Let's look for some other shapes that we see. So all we were doing was looking at the background stitching. But when we join some lines on the diagonal, we see what we can actually have is some background grid work we've created. See the squares that I've drawn the whole way. We can do that over the whole quilt, and we can finish it with many different ways. I've showed you a few. Here's one where I've just done some curved work. I just did them quickly, and I'm just looking at the blocks with the jewels in them. I can also turn this into some grid work. Oh, this over the whole quilt, done in the background stitching. It would be gorgeous. Stitching in the ditch, I would stitch around these blocks, and I would stitch around the jewels. I would really get this looking nice and flat to do the grid work. We could do our little friend that keeps popping up to do it more quickly. I showed you some other designs you can do using your horizontal and vertical, all of your 8 different sections. We could do just that little, what we did all over the background stitching, we could do in the idea of a block. Here's a little feather wreath. Here's options to do in the blocks by themselves with those designs so that it didn't become too boring. We could do that. Ideas for the outside. Here's that little feather that tapers on each side that we could do. And then using that grid work again. Now we could still come through here and stitch in the ditch so we didn't have to stop. And do some beautiful grid work. You could come back through it again, just working your way through it on each side. Stitch within that grid. Beautiful. We have a lot of borders doing it this way, but we have swirl opportunities. I've shown you the scrolls before with feathers and swirls, whatever you want to do in those. But then we keep having borders, so what do we do on the outside? Well, for this one, one idea was to do straight, just a couple of straight lines. Do I need to do it? Well, it's 2 inches. You decide. You could leave it empty. If you do, regardless, if you're going to stitch the borders separately, I would, and I didn't mention this, I apologize, beforehand, well, actually, when I got done with this intersection, then, and I tend to do it afterwards, then I would stitch in the ditch on these borders and go around, and then I would stitch this, and then I would stitch the next border. Why do I do this? I used to not. But especially with double batting, which that's where you get into the trouble, it can still shift a little bit, even with small sections. So I'll stitch in the ditch as I go so I don't get caught. With a single layer, you're probably not going to have to worry about it. I just do it out of habit. And then you could leave it empty, or you could come in and just do a couple of horizontal lines. And then again, you could come in and do the straight lines, whether they're just so far apart or following the pattern that I described previously. So several different ways to quilt this quilt, and it is gorgeous. And I have to admit, here's a close-up of some of the work where I was working on it as well. You can see a little bit closer up what I may do to those blocks. My favorites, I love this. I do love this. I love it classic. It would be simple. It would be easy. It would be gorgeous. And of course, I would use your background thread. And then I really like the way this turns out. However, I like all, but maybe I don't care too much for these. I'd have to work on them. but I love all of these as well. And you would have much more of a complex quilt. So it's your choice. What would you do with it? What did you see when you first looked at it? Give me some feedback and have a super week. We'll see you Wednesday.